Perhaps even more so than in the world of film, the video game industry just won't let a brand name die. Because with a recognizable IP, there is always the delicious opportunity to make some more money. That is clearly what was on publishers' minds when they refused to let these concrete video game endings lie, instead undoing them with follow-ups that, regardless of their eventual quality, couldn't help but feel a tad unnecessary. Whatever the outcome, it was obvious that developers really hadn't considered the possibility of a sequel when conceiving their initial story, and so when the publisher decided they wanted another game, all involved had to strain to figure out how to make it happen. With that in mind, I'm Will for WhatCulture, and here are 10 video game stories that clearly ended and then got a sequel. 10. Resident Evil 5. Though the Resident Evil franchise has been guilty of ass-pulling sequels pretty much since its inception, this practice reached its cynical apex after the 5th game in the series. Resi 5 concluded with the comically over-the-top demise of the franchise's iconic antagonist, Albert Wesker, who gets blown up by not one, but 2 RPGs. With Wesker dead and the virus destroyed, it felt like a decisive tying off of all the loose ends, only for Resident Evil 6 to reveal that another big bad organization, Neo Umbrella, was using yet another virus to try and achieve world domination. On top of that, Resi 6 further drew attention to its own patent lack of imagination by dusting off a number of the series' most revered heroes, namely Leon and Chris, for an exhaustingly over-egged romp that's largely credited with being divisive enough to end the series' original run. Even if you enjoyed the schlock that was Resident Evil 6, Capcom announcing a first-person quasi-reboot for the 7 main game was the best thing they could have done for the series' longevity, and Resi 7 is, frankly, amazing. 9. Final Fantasy X. Though the mainline Final Fantasy games tend to be almost entirely standalone, Square Enix have released several spin-off sequels to some of the more recent numbered entries into the series, starting off with Final Fantasy X. Now, Final Fantasy X actually ended pretty tidily, with Yu defeated and Sin seemingly gone forever, while Tidus heartbreakingly disappeared. It was a classic bittersweet happy ending, until the release of the wildly unnecessary Final Fantasy X2, or is it Final Fantasy X-2? Whatever way you want to say it, a few years later. It was a classic case of undoing a watertight ending in the pursuit of more money, and though FFX2 is rather enjoyable as a silly addition to the main franchise, it's also completely excessive as a piece of storytelling. 8. Max Payne 2. Max Payne 2 is one of the greatest video game sequels ever made, an electrifying action extravaganza which concludes with Max Payne murdering the hell out of everyone who opposes him, while his lover Mona Sachs also ends up biting the bullet. Most importantly, the game ends with Max finally learning to deal with the murder of his family, placing a blood-soaked capper on his ultra-violent journey across the 2 games. Series writer Sam Lake later confirmed that he had always designed Max Payne 2 to be the series finale, so when Rockstar Games, who bought the IP after the first game, went ahead with a threequel without Lake's involvement, it was quite literally a case of bringing a done franchise back to life. Controversially, Max Payne 3 ditched the series' classic noir aesthetic and effectively undid Max's happy-ish ending by making him an alcoholic drug addict who gets roped into a kidnapping plot. In fairness, Max Payne 3 was absolutely spectacular from a gameplay perspective, though coming almost a decade after the last game and scarcely resembling its style, it almost felt like a totally different experience with the Max Payne label slapped on. 7. Dead Space 3. This is an especially baffling case, given that Dead Space 3's story was very decisively wrapped up, only for the Awakened DLC released barely a month later to lazily crowbar it wide open again. You see, the base version of Dead Space 3 ended with Isaac and Carver seemingly sacrificing themselves for the greater good in order to wipe the necromorphs out. But of course, Visceral Games had already completed their sequel DLC, and so included a post-credit scene in the game which hinted at Isaac and Carver still being alive. Lo and behold, rather than give them a fitting hero's demise, Awakened revealed that Isaac and Carver survived, and worse still, neither the necromorphs nor the marker had been entirely wiped out. Oh, and Earth was now overrun by necromorphs. Great. In an added dose of irony, Awakened's bleak ending seemed primed to set the table for a 4th game which to date has not materialized. 6. Gears of War 3. Much like Resident Evil, Gears of War has made a habit out of transparently hitting the reset button with each new sequel. Though each game tends to end with a major threat being vanquished, of course there's always something new lurking out there. Even so, Gears of War 3 truly felt like a culmination of everything fans had experienced up till that point. The Locust, Lambert, and the Emulsion were all wiped out, while Marcus was left to thoughtfully ponder the sacrifices of Adam and Dom as he looked hopefully towards Earth's future. The fact that Gears of War 4 took another 5 years to release probably confirms how thoroughly the third game wrote the team into a corner, and so it ultimately takes place 25 years after Gears 3, with a new monstrous race called the Swarm being swiftly introduced as the successor to the Locust. Though it's not remotely surprising that a fourth Gears game happened, it barreled through the previous game's happy ending without a damn care in the world. 5. Tomb Raider: The Last Revelation. In contrast to Gears 3, the Tomb Raider franchise seemed primed to offer up a decidedly less happy ending with the shocking conclusion to the fourth game, The Last Revelation. The game was created and marketed as the final entry into the series, due to the developers' core design feeling that the franchise had run its course. And so, The Last Revelation ended in jaw-droppingly dark fashion, with Lara Croft seemingly buried alive inside a collapsed tomb after refusing help from her former mentor. It received broadly positive reviews and was accepted to be a fitting send-off for the series, only for the publishers to quickly greenlight the release of another game, Tomb Raider Chronicles, which came out just a year later. Though Chronicles was primarily a prequel, it ended with the reveal that Lara was in fact alive, before the next game, The Angel of Darkness, acted as a direct sequel to The Last Revelation and brought Lara back in dubious earnest. Unlike most games on this list, both of these follow-ups were critically and commercially unsuccessful, resulting in the franchise eventually being given to Crystal Dynamics, while core design fell into disrepute and was eventually closed. 4. Halo 3. After the deeply unsatisfying ending to Halo 2, fans were chomping at the bit to get their hands on the third game, which Microsoft cannily marketed with the tagline "Finish the fight," as if to acknowledge how infuriating the second game's abrupt finale was. And given that Halo 3 was originally conceived as the end of the series, it seemed to be a relatively honest tagline. Furthermore, the game's final scene sees Cortana and Master Chief agreeing that the Prophet of Truth, the Covenant, and the Flood are all dealt with, and literally declaring that their job is finished. Even with Master Chief adrift in cryo-sleep at the end of the game, and the legendary ending hinting at more adventures to come, it felt like a relatively tidy conclusion to the franchise. But of course, with the game's stonking commercial success, it was never going to be the end. After a host of spin-off titles were released, Halo 4 finally hit stores in 2012, kickstarting a new conflict against the alien race known as the Prometheans, in turn laying the groundwork for a new trilogy of Halo titles set to culminate in the release of Halo Infinite later this year. 3. Mass Effect 3. Say what you will about Mass Effect 3, but it was undeniably the epic climax of 3 games worth of spacefaring, and while the ending was ultimately a little unsatisfying, it nevertheless placed a definitive full stop on Commander Shepard's conflict with the Reapers. But rather than have BioWare turn their talents towards developing a new IP, EA instead insisted that they would give Mass Effect the soft reboot treatment with Mass Effect Andromeda, ditching the numbered titling and transpiring 600 years after the third game with an entirely new cast of characters. While on one hand you can argue it's a good thing that EA and BioWare didn't lazily dust off Shepard for another sequel, Mass Effect 3 still felt like a decisive climax in its own right, while Andromeda just came across as a cynical attempt to recycle the series branding for another go around. 2. Metal Gear Solid 4. Metal Gear Solid 4 truly felt like as concrete an ending to the Solid Snake saga as humanly possible. The game tied off almost every imaginable plot thread, and by allowing old Snake to live out his remaining life peacefully off-screen, it was both melancholic and fitting. Most fans believed a 5th MGS game would never come to fruition, only for a spin-off sequel, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, to be announced just a year after MGS4's release. Revengeance, eventually released in 2013, was set 4 years after Guns of the Patriots and followed Raiden in a world now defined by the conflict between various private military companies operating globally. If nothing else, it felt like an excessive addendum to the story sewn up by MGS4. A fifth Metal Gear Solid game, The Phantom Pain, was eventually released in 2015, a prequel which heavily recontextualized the events of the series, namely the identity of Big Boss, to a heavily polarized response from fans. As enjoyable as these two games were from a gameplay perspective, neither really justified their own existence story-wise, especially with Guns of the Patriot's overwhelming sense of closure and finality. 1. Portal. Valve's ingenious puzzle platformer ends with protagonist Shell destroying GLaDOS' final personality core, after which the room is ripped apart and Shell awakens outside Aperture Science's Enrichment Center. Though the iconic end credits song Still Alive certainly left the door open for a sequel by hinting at GLaDOS' survival, this could just have easily been a playful gag that went nowhere. But in early 2010, almost 2.5 years after the game was released, Valve actually patched Portal with an expanded ending, which saw Shell being dragged away from the scene by a robotic party associate, only for Portal 2 to be announced a few days later. It was certainly a novel way to retcon the game's ending, that's for sure, even if, for those playing Portal on launch, it felt like a totally standalone one-off experience while they waited for, gulp, Half-Life 3. Thankfully, Portal 2 turned out to be even better than its predecessor, so this is a rare case of a game's story being artificially extended for the better. And there you have it, folks, 10 video game stories that clearly ended and then got a sequel. Feel free to drop this video a like if you enjoyed it, and drop me a follow on Twitter at YouSlideDowellU. I'm Will for WhatCulture, thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you next time.